Hey, everybody. Some of you who were still in our classroom last year when we first went home from all this virusy stuff may remember that we used to do lessons that were recorded. Those of you who are new, this is something we're just doing this week because I'm busy taking your class the first 3 days, so we can't have lessons together online. So your job is going to be to listen to this lesson and then maybe take some notes or write about it. Or if it makes you think of something else you want to discover, go do some research and investigate that new thing. However you want to follow up from the lesson is your choice. Maybe you'll work on it for a long time, or maybe you'll just write down a couple notes and be done. Whichever you choose is absolutely okay. So this, my friends, is a history lesson. And this is a history lesson that takes place about 50 years ago, but also takes place about 2,300 years ago. It is a split history lesson. And it starts for us in the 1970s. That's the about 50 years ago part. And this story starts with some farmers who were digging a hole in China. They were digging a hole in China trying to make a well. They didn't live in the part of China where it's really, really cold up to the north. And they didn't live in the part of China that touches the ocean to the east. They lived right about in the middle of China, which is a place where it is very dry. If you look on a map, this is the place where they live, right here in the middle of China. Now, those farmers were digging themselves a well. And digging a well means you have to dig pretty deep. You can't dig just a little tiny scoop into the soil and get water like you can at the beach, because these people are quite a distance from the ocean. So to be able to reach the groundwater, the rivers and lakes that are under the ground all over the world, these farmers had to dig a big hole. And they had been digging for a couple days. And first, when they were digging, after a while, they started to notice they were finding this reddish soil. And that wasn't the soil of the area they lived in. They thought, what is this weird reddish soil? But their job was to dig a well. So they kept digging. And after a while, their shovels bumped into something hard. Now, if you were digging and your shovel bumped into something hard, you might think, that's probably a rock. And I imagine that's what those farmers thought at first too. They kept digging, scooping out around this hard thing, trying to be able to pry it up and get it out of where they were building their well. But as they kept digging and trying to get under this hard thing, this may be a rock, they kept discovering that it kept going down. It went down about this far. And then it kept going down farther. And they kept digging and kept digging and kept digging until they discovered something that looked a whole lot like this. They discovered a statue made of a warrior, somebody who was dressed in the type of clothing that warriors wore in China a long, long time ago. People who fought for the emperor and helped protect him would have worn clothing like this. But this warrior was not a warrior who had died and been buried there. This was a statue of a warrior made of something called terracotta. If you're ever planting plants and you use the type of pots that are kind of an orangish brown, those are terracotta pots. Terracotta is like a type of clay. So this was a statue of a warrior made entirely of a type of clay. And it wasn't small. It was the real size of a person. It was about 6 feet tall. And as these farmers kept digging this guy out, they kept digging out this terracotta warrior statue. They found arrows and crossbows and broken bits of other human statues that looked a lot like the whole one they found where they were trying to dig their well. And after a bit, they realized they had found something special. They found a giant statue of a dude where they were trying to dig a well, and that's a pretty important thing. So they contacted some people who like to study history, and they called them out, and it started a huge investigation. And this investigation ended up discovering that what these farmers had stumbled upon on accident what they discovered while they were just doing their work and trying to dig a well was actually a mausoleum. A mausoleum is like a special place for honoring and burying a dead person. It's kind of like the huge pyramids that were made in Egypt for a time. But in China, instead of using pyramids, they made a different shape. That might be something you want to investigate and study today, by the way. You might want to look into different types of buildings that different cultures throughout history and around the world have used to honor their dead. There are stories of these types of buildings all over the world. You could find some that are local near us, some that happened in the United States on the West Coast. You could find what people did in South America. You could find out a lot of cool stuff. So keep that in mind if you're thinking of something to research today. Now, when this mausoleum started to be uncovered, some of the evidence they found showed who it belonged to. And this is where we go to our more than 2,000 years ago part of our story. So we know that we are in the year 2021 right now. And remember that time goes backwards down to zero. And when we get to the year zero, we start counting up again, just like you do with negative numbers. But in time, we don't say -1 year or -2 year. We say either BCE or BC to mean the times back before zero. And what the scientists and historians who were investigating this mausoleum uncovered in the middle of a farmer's field discovered was that this was a place built for an emperor who lived around the time of 246 BC. 246 BC is when this man named Qin Shi Huang was the emperor. He became emperor when he was only 13 years old. Think about that. Now, we know that things were different a long time ago. Children were expected to be grown up a lot sooner than they are now. But there are people in our class who are 12, and this guy became emperor when he was 13, which I think is an interesting thing to keep in mind. Now, as soon as he became emperor, some important, huge work got started. He knew that eventually he would die because he's a human, that happens. And when he did, he wanted a big, important place to be buried. And so he commanded people to start building him this big, giant mausoleum. Now, some of the people that he had doing this work were people who wanted to do the work. They were getting paid for it, and it was their choice. But a lot of the people who were doing this work did not have a choice. A lot of the people were enslaved. He kept them and made them do the work, whether they wanted to do it or not. And maybe they didn't get paid. A lot of the time they didn't. And so that's a good thing to remember too, is that when we look at these really big things that were created, a lot of times the people doing the hard work didn't have a choice and didn't want to be doing it. I think that's important to keep in mind. But anyway, these people who were doing the work of building this mausoleum for Qin Shi Huang the whole time that he was emperor, they were building and building and building, and they couldn't do this work in just a day. They couldn't do this work in just a year. It took them until past the time of the emperor's death to finish this place because they built over an area of about 38 square miles. Remember, when we say square miles, we mean that if you go 1 mile this way and 1 mile this way and turn it into a square, that space is 1 square mile. This place that they discovered was about 38 square miles. Now, that number probably feels a little random, but I bet you can picture about how big McMinnville is. If you think about McMinnville from the edge by the airport and the museum of all of the airplanes that has the Spruce Goose and the water park, all the way to the other end of McMinnville, where you start driving and there are no more stores or houses anymore and you're back out in fields, the big old space that McMinnville takes up is only about a quarter of the space that this mausoleum took up. You could fit 4 McMinnvilles inside of this mausoleum. So no wonder it took them decades to build. It took them tens of years to build this because it was huge. And it took a lot of work to get back into it. When these historians wanted to do their discoveries, they had to dig deep down into the soil because over the more than 2,000 years that passed since this creation was finished, the world had changed. Dirt had been moved by wind and by the work of people and the work of water, and had been deposited on top of this mausoleum and covered it and covered it and covered it. So they had to dig down underground. And what they found when they got there was what looked like a whole town hidden underground. And not a little town, but a pretty fancy big town. The town was surrounded with walls made of rammed earth. What that means is that the walls were stone, and then in between the stone, they would put in dirt and pound it down with big old poundy things until it was hard packed dirt in between. This was a way of making walls that made really strong walls without needing them to be stone all the way through. And that's what the historians found when they unearthed this town. It was surrounded by these walls. And as they kept digging, they discovered that inside the walls, there was something amazing. I'm going to share a picture with you. Inside the walls, there were statues, many, many statues of warriors, all lined up, all facing the walls and all facing to the east. Now, historians don't know for sure why these people were all facing to the east. Maybe it had something to do with religious beliefs, but some of them think that the reason these statues were set up facing to the east is because this emperor, Qing Shi Huang, he fought a lot of people, and most of the people he fought were to the east. And so many historians believe that these terracotta warriors, these statues, were built and placed facing to the east like guards to make sure that even once he was dead, the emperor would be protected. That's kind of what the historians believe was the whole idea of this place. The people who built it and the emperor who was buried there believed that even after he was dead, he should have a very important place to live. Whether it was his body or his spirit or his soul or whatever happened to be left, they believed that it needed a special place to live that was as special as the fancy places the emperor had lived when he was alive. And so he needed to have people there to take care of him. And that's what they made the statues for. They were kind of built to honor him, but also kind of built to protect him and take care of him after he was dead. It's an interesting idea that you might want to look into some more. Now, they kept going. They kept digging deeper, and they found row after row after row of warriors. And when they looked at them, they discovered something special. They weren't all the same. The warriors were made using a mold, which means a big empty space that you fill, and then when it hardens, you take it off and it gives you the shape. Kind of like if you've ever made candies where you melt chocolate and pour them into a mold and then take it back out, things like that. But they weren't all made from the same mold. So far, they've discovered at least 10 face shapes. But there were way more than 10 different warrior faces in the statues they found. Because when these statues were made, they used the molds to make the basic shape. Kind of like when you're drawing, you might start with a sort of a stick person shape and then start adding on muscles and tissue and clothes and facial features and all of those layers. And that was how these terracotta warriors were built. They started with a simple mold, but then individual people would come in and make every single face a little bit different. Some of them might have facial hair, like beards and mustaches, and some of them might not. And some of them might have a scar, and some of them might not. And some of them might have eyes that were a little closer together or a little farther apart. Some might have really slim faces, and some might have slightly wider faces. And as far as the historians have discovered, with all of their investigating up to now, no two faces are exactly alike. Now, in that picture, I'm going to show it to you again. You can probably see that there were a lot of warriors there. But there weren't just warriors. There were also horses. I'm going to take my little writing on the screen pen. See that horse right there? There were horses pulling chariots. Chariots are like fancy carts used for war, like war carts from back before there were cars and things of that nature. And when they started discovering and started counting up what they found, the historians discovered that there were about 130 chariots and 520 horses and 150 horses on their own that were not pulling the chariots, and about 8,000 soldiers. 8,000. When you think about our math materials, the 1,000 is the big cube, right? 8,000 warriors that were all made and put together by hand. And then it keeps going. Because when they built this mausoleum, they didn't just want there to be warriors. They wanted it to be like a whole town. So as the historians kept digging and kept going further in, they found things like office buildings, places with desks set up made of wood or made of clay, and all sorts of supplies, and people sitting at the desks that were statues too. And they found acrobats and musicians and all sorts of different statues, as if they were building a whole world there. There were even stables built underground where no living horses would ever go, and people and a whole lot of treasure. All of these things were found underground, which I think is pretty neat, that they found almost a whole pretend world set up down there. Now, this is pretty cool in general, but I think it keeps getting cooler because when these statues were made, they were dressed up in real armor to make them look more realistic. Many of them were given real weapons, like metal weapons to hold. Some of them had armor that was made of wood, and some of them had armor that was made of leather and helmets made of metal. And some of those things were still there when the historians found them. Some of the weapons they discovered were stolen, like right after the mausoleum was built, but many were still there, which means that now the historians have a collection. They have tons and tons of these statue guys, but also a bunch of examples of weapons and armor from this time. And that's pretty cool too. I'm going to show you a couple more pictures and then tell you the last thing. Now, I assume you're noticing that all of these people are kind of just stone colored, right? Some of them have armor that is made of their stone, and some of them were dressed in armor that was made out of normal armor, things like that a real person could wear. But when they were created, these people were not created just in stone color. When they were created, they were painted. They were completely painted to look like people, but the paint couldn't survive. What I think is really sad is that the paint survived for a couple thousand years. The whole time it was buried, the paint was still there. But when they cracked open the mausoleum, when they dug down and opened up the space, as soon as the air got in, it started damaging the paint. In less than 15 seconds, the paint would start to peel and curl off of the statues. And by the time they'd sat for about 4 minutes, almost all the paint would have flaked and fallen to the ground. So these statues stayed painted for a very, very long time until humans discovered them and let air get in to get them. Now, the good side of this is that the little flakes of paint that fell to the ground as soon as the air could reach it were still something that scientists could look at. And so they analyzed the paint bits and figured out what colors they would have been. And in the museum that you can go to in China and see these things, they have some people that they repainted. Here are 2 of the statues that they removed from the mausoleum underground, and they brought them into a museum, and they painted them with their best guess, their best scientific guess based on the color bits that they found on the ground of what they would have looked like. So not only was the work of making these the work of building them and sculpting them to get them just perfect and lining them up so they were in perfect formation, all facing east, there was also the work of painting them. And all of this work was done in honor of one emperor. I like to think about how all over the world, all through history, people have chosen to do big things, or in the case of some of these people, chosen to make people do these things for them, to honor their dead. And that means that all over the world, there are probably places we haven't found yet. There are probably places somewhere built to honor someone that we don't know about. And all we're waiting for is one random chance. Just like those farmers who went to try and dig a well so they could have water to keep their crops alive, they discovered this amazing thing. Maybe it'll be you someday. You never know. You could be out in the forest camping and come upon something. You could be out at the beach and have something wash up on shore. Someday you could be digging a hole in your garden and maybe find something. Maybe you'll be a historian and try and find these things. Or maybe it'll just happen by luck, because sometimes the world is cool like that. If you would like to research these guys some more, these terracotta statues, you can try searching the words Terracotta Army, because that's what they've been called since they were discovered. If you want to investigate that, go for it. If you want to take some notes or draw a picture about your favorite part of this lesson, what it made you think of, you can do that. If you have a person available in your house to talk to, you could just go talk to them about it a little. Or you could record for me your thoughts in Seesaw and send me those. Whatever you do, though, it is your job to follow up from this lesson in some way. That means talk about it, read about it, write about it, draw about it, learn more about something it made you think about, but do something to keep working your brain. And in a couple days, I'll see you again and we'll start spending some time together. Meanwhile, I miss you and I hope you enjoyed the lesson and I hope you find some cool things to go research on your own. Bye for now.